Let's get the penultimate webinar started, shall we? It's going to be a big one today. We're going to be covering a review of all of the species that we've covered so far, and I'm excited for it, but it's going to be a big one. Got my glass of water ready. Before we get started, I'd just like to say that I am coming at you today from Saskatoon, and we're located on Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the homelands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis. I, of course, am your host, Leanne Latramoy, and I have the pleasure of working for Birds Canada. So, welcome. This should be a fun one. On the agenda for tonight, I'll first show you all of the dates that we have set up for marsh walks. I have some of them, solidified in terms of plans, and you can go visit the website for details on those. We'll also talk about what the agenda for our final webinar is going to look like next week, and then we're going to review all of the species covered. All of this is going to be recorded and posted online. And afterwards, as usual, we'll turn off the recording and we'll discuss. There isn't going to be a Zoom quiz this week because it would just be really, really massive to try to do at the end. So instead, there's a bunch of quizzes online on the MarshWatch website that, I went through last year and, made several large quizzes, so you can go ahead and do those. So marsh walks. We've got Regina in the books. We are going to go to the McKell Conservation Area along Wascana Creek. Saskatoon, we're going to be going to Hyde Park on Saturday, June 15th. In Prince Albert, we're going to be going out to some private property. So I'm going to make that one an event that you register for because I don't want to put someone's address out there for everyone to see. So I still have to develop that one. Brandon, we're going to be at the Riverbank Discovery Center. In Winnipeg, it looks like we're going to be going to Fort White Alive because I have found a little bit of budget, and I think we're going to, keep it a relatively small group, but we'll be able to cover the admission costs for anybody who's not already a member of Fort White Alive. So if you live in Winnipeg, keep an eye out for that. Hopefully I will be, getting that set up over the next several days here. And then lastly, we'll also go to Blaine Lake, and I'll put details in that one as soon as I've got them a little bit more sorted out. But visit the MarshWatch page. All of the walks are going to be linked on there, and you can click on each one for further details if you would like to join. And I would love to see you. It's putting all of this stuff into practice that is a ton of fun. So next week, the webinar is going to consist of a brief recap of why wetlands are important, and then we're going to spend some time listening to the actual soundscape. So we're going to, be listening to recordings of wetlands from Saskatchewan and, talk through them, point out certain birds, and help you start to tune your ear in because it's kind of amazing. You can learn the songs and the calls, but when you get out there in real life, they're all going at the same time, and it's a bit of a skill to, learn to pick different pieces out. It's like, if you're listening to the music for the first time, maybe you're not a musician, you can't really pick out an individual instrument, but maybe you start picking up the guitar and that tunes your ear in for learning about a certain instrument. It's the same with birds. So sometimes it's going to sound like a cacophony of just bird noises, but once you start figuring out what some of those bird noises are, some of it's going to start to make a little bit more sense for you. So we'll do plenty of soundscapes. I'm going to include the plant review in that session, and then I'll just talk about some of the stats, like how many people attended the webinars so far. And afterwards, we'll have, questions and discussion, and you can, ask me anything. Okay, so we actually covered a whole lot of bird species. It kind of, didn't feel so onerous because we did them in little chunks week by week, but all told, we covered 47 bird species. I'm not going to list them all. It's just impressive to see them on the screen, and 12 amphibians. Oh, yeah, it's about 12 amphibians. There we go. I did do my math correctly. Anyway, so we covered a fair bit in these series, so I'm pretty impressed, and hopefully, you're retaining a little bit of it yourself. But we're gonna dive right in, and we're gonna just quickly go over kind of the key identification features of each species. And I've got little symbols up here in the corner of the photos, and I'm not going to play the sounds of each, species. I'm going to play the sounds of the species that are kind of distinct, or, a bird that makes calls and songs, it's going to be useful to your identification of it, because there's some things that really, you should focus more on the visual. They make a generic quack, or it's not they're not terribly vocal, then you focus a bit more on the visual clues. So I've got that handy little kind of cheat sheet for each species up there in the corner. But where else to start but the Canada goose? This is going to be, the easiest one, I think, for pretty much anybody. This is a very large goose, got that beautiful little white chin strap, and otherwise, black head and neck and that kind of brownish body, big black legs. And they are useful to identify by sound, and this is something that I'm sure many people are quite familiar with. It's the honking of the Canada goose. So that is the Canada goose, something that everyone's going to be familiar with. We're going to move on now to the ducks, and I just want to remind you about a really helpful kind of behavior clue that you can use to immediately separate the duck species into two kind of distinct groups. We've got the dabblers and we've got the divers. The dabblers tip up or feed at the water's surface, and they're built for a little bit better stability on land. They're good at walking, they've got their legs kind of centrally located, and they can fly from a standstill. So they can take off from solid ground, they can take off straight up from the water and go, essentially straight up into the air. Divers, on the other hand, these are going to be ducks that dive below the water's surface in search of food, whether that be plant material or animal material. So they dive below the surface, and they're definitely built for that. They've got legs farther back on their bodies, which means you're not going to see them, out and about in a pea field or anything in the fall. They're not going to be wandering around a city park. They're going to be, sticking really close to the water's edge when they do get out of the water. So they've got their legs farther back on their body. That's really good for propulsion, but not great for walking. And their wings are a little bit reduced compared to their body size. So they actually need a little runway, like you can see these canvasbacks. They need to run, 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 and flap their wings so that they can get airborne. So these are ducks that if they, were stranded somewhere on land, that they wouldn't be able to get up in the air without help. And indeed, if you're, banding ducks, when you're releasing divers, you actually kind of throw them up into the air so that they can get that little bit of airborne necessary to, get flying. Otherwise, you put them, in the water, but sometimes where you're banding them, it might be far enough away from the water area. So divers definitely, aren't great at flying straight up in the air. They can't do it. They need that little runway, their little feet to get going. And they actually do have, um, fast wing beats because their wings aren't quite so broad. So they're, if you get really into like looking at ducks, you can sort of tell as they're flying because the divers are going to have much faster wing beats when compared to dabblers. Another thing that's useful to take a look at, especially on the dabblers, because they're more brightly colored in this regard, is the wing pattern. So there's a speculum patch. These are the secondary feathers on, on the wing. So here are your bright secondary feathers making a speculum patch. And some species also have a bit of a forewing patch. Like this blue-winged teal has this kind of powdery blue and white for its forewing patch. Really quite bold and quite bright. And this is helpful when you're seeing, the duck in flight. Divers sometimes have a little bit of patterning going on, but for the most part, their wings are kind of dark and not the most distinctive. So it's less helpful than it is in the dabbling species. I can see a question. Do some divers fly underwater using feet versus using feet to swim? I really generally mostly see when I've seen ducks underwater, and I'm thinking I've seen cormorants, they usually use their feet a bit more than their wings. Maybe they use a little bit of their wings, I'm not sure. I know cormorants that I've watched swim underwater, they mostly just do that with their back feet that I've seen. Okay, starting off our dabbling ducks, we've got two drakes with green heads. We've got the mallard and the northern shoveler. The key here, take a look at the bills. The mallard is going to have this bright yellow bill. It really, stands out in contrast to its shiny green head. The northern shoveler, as the name suggests, has this great big spatulate bill on the end of its face. It's really big, it's really quite exaggerated. It's also jet black. Now, just a reminder that any of these kind of shiny feathers, iridescent feathers, it's really going to depend on how the light is hitting the feathers and where you're at relative to the bird and the light hitting the feathers, because that's all kind of this refracted, reflected color. So in in different lighting, they can appear almost bluish, or they can look pretty much jet black if if the light isn't bouncing back at your eye the right way. So just keep that in mind whenever you see something that's shiny on a bird. It's going to be really position dependent and lighting dependent how that's going to look. Northern shoveler, one of the biggest things is going to be looking at the side of the body. It's got this great big chestnut colored patch on this white side that really stands out at a distance. And especially for ducks, it's really useful to pay attention to where the white is on the bird, because white reflects back all of the visible light rays back at you, and so it has the best chance of kind of standing out at a distance. So anything that's bright, plain white is really going to appear, quite bright, especially at a distance. Or if you've got terrible lighting conditions, say it's foggy or they're just far away, the white color is really going to be the thing that stands out still at a distance. You can have both of these ducks looking fairly dark, but those little white highlights are really going to stand out. So remember to pay attention to where the white is. It's a little bit less useful on the mallard, but it does have that nice little ring around the neck, and those just the tail feathers themselves, not any of the other associated feathers, just those little tail feathers are white right there for mallard. The northern shoveler does make a kind of distinctive call, and they're a rather chatty duck. So especially as they're flying around, you'll often hear them do this kind of suk 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 call. I'll play it for you now. That's kind of one of the distinctive duck calls. I'll play it once more. Okay, so those are our dabbling ducks with green heads. In flight, the mallard's going to show this speculum patch that's blue, bordered with black and white. It's also iridescent, so sometimes, depending on how the light is hitting it, it can look quite purplish, or it can appear quite dark and black. But that pattern there with the, colored center and the black and white border above and below is quite distinct for mallard. Northern shoveler in flight is going to show this kind of dark green speculum with that forewing patch, going to be nice powdery blue with a stripe of white. It's going to look pretty much identical in flight to the blue-winged teal, but the blue-winged teal is going to be, much smaller and it isn't going to have this great big honkin', shoehorn on the front of the duck's face. So those are our dabbling ducks in flight with the green heads. Okay, two other largish dabbling ducks. We have the gadwall here on the left and the northern pintail on the right. The gadwall, the drake, is going to be really quite plain, really not the most flashy duck in town. Going to overall look kind of grayish brown, especially at a distance. You're going to lose all of these fine little barring and patterning. The thing that stands out about the gadwall is going to be this entirely black, gigantic patch on the rear end. It stands out like a sore thumb at a distance. Otherwise, you've got this brownish bird and this great big just chunk of black on, the back half of the bird. So keep in mind, take a look out for that great big black rump. It stands out like a sore thumb. Bill-wise, it's kind of this mix of orange and black. You can think of it as a black bill with some orange highlights along the side. So it's a nice, handsome little bill. Northern pintail is a really elegant duck. They tend to have kind of a longer, slender neck than most other ducks. Of course, they can, hold it down, and the bird's posture is really going to affect how it appears, but overall it really has a slender look, and that's kind of highlighted by this white neck and this kind of whitish spur that goes up the back of the head. Really kind of exaggerates that long, kind of elegant look to it. Otherwise, it's going to have this, solid brown chestnutty face. The bill is this kind of striking blue and black, and the long tail, that kind of pin tail on the end of it, is really going to be distinct, this kind of really long, pointy tail. Sound-wise, the gadwall is going to be quite chatty as well, like the northern shoveler, and it goes bep, 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 bep. And if you're familiar at all with Sesame Street, this sounds like the aliens, the little yip yips. So here's the gadwall bepping. So as you can tell, they bep a lot. They'll do this in flight, so it's really, a useful one to learn, that little bepping of the gadwall. So those are our two larger dabbling ducks. In flight, the gadwall is going to show this kind of small white, almost a square, and a little crescent shaped speculum patch with a little bit of black, and there's going to be a bit of a rusty forewing patch as well. In flight, the northern shoveler is going to show this kind of iridescent greenish speculum that's bordered below with white and above kind of this buffy straw tawny color. Okay, shrinking down a little bit in size, we've got some smaller dabbling ducks. Blue-winged teal and green-winged teal are going to be your smallest, with green-winged teal being the smallest of all of them, as well as American widgeon. So blue-winged teal, the drake is going to have this lovely kind of dark bluish head and this, oops, bumped my mouse there. And it's also going to have this white crescent. It's really, really big between the eye and the bill. So this great big white crescent. Rear end, it's going to be black and white. Otherwise, kind of this speckly side. Green-winged teal is going to have this beautiful kind of, dramatic eyeshadow going down the back of the head from the eye. The American widgeon is also going to have a similar greenish patch, but otherwise these two ducks look fairly different. The green-winged teal is going to have gray flanks and this kind of great big white spur that's really going to contrast with the darker feathers around it. This little white spur is really, really helpful for, trying to figure out what that duck is. See that great big white spur? Otherwise, fully contrasting with the rest of the duck, it's going to be a green-winged teal. The face is nice and chestnut, but in low light conditions, that it's amazing how kind of the green and red can merge together. So if you have poor visibility, poor lighting, what you're really going to want to focus on is see this little spike here, that little white spur on the flank. On the rear end, it's kind of got a triangle of white bordered in black, so that can be another useful clue. The American widgeon, really interesting little duck because there's variation in the amount of white on the drake's head. So most of them will show this kind of forehead patch in white, and many of them kind of have this kind of speckly grayish looking cheek, but some of them can be quite white and some of them can have a fairly reduced kind of forehead patch. This is kind of like an average looking male. What really stands out to me whenever I see American widgeon is kind of this overall pinkish color to the body of the bird. For whatever reason, that always stands out to me. Otherwise, it kind of has that same black and white colored rear as the blue-winged teal, but this really plain, really kind of, I don't know, dusky pink color on the side really stands out. Also on the bill, it's going to be kind of this, black border on this pale blue little bill. Quite a handsome little duck. All of them are kind of, small to medium size. The American widgeon's not a very large duck. The American widgeon as well is not one of the more abundant ducks, so you don't tend to see them as frequently as you do other species. In flight, the blue-winged teal is going to show that kind of greenish speculum that's bordered with a little white top and the powdery blue forewing patch. If you remember back to our um, northern shoveler, there we go, the northern shoveler drake, the wing is going to look fairly similar, but overall the bird looks quite different. In flight especially, the blue-winged teal really looks brownish overall, and it's that white crescent on the front of the face that still really stands out even in flight. The green-winged teal has a lovely greenish speculum, kind of half green, half black, and it's bordered above and below with kind of this buffy, straw color. American widgeon in flight is also going to have a bit of a green and black speculum, but a little bit less green, a little more reduced there. And it's going to have this nice white forewing patch. So That's just in case you happen to see them in flight and are able to remember some of those clues, but it's always nice to see. Okay, so we're going to talk about hens here, and I wanted to throw up this, little graphic that I have. You'll see it again. And just if you're looking at these ducks, there's, there's two groupings, and I've highlighted it here with the line, but the ducks on top, these are all dabbling duck hens, and you can see that they all have these kind of really intricately patterned body feathers. They're not really very plain at all in their brownness. There's each feather has a little bit of light and dark shadowing on it. They're really quite intricate. And this is because the dabbling ducks are going to be nesting on land. They'll nest, up in, the dry land areas. Some of them quite a ways, like mallards. They'll nest everywhere, and they'll just, march their little kids out to a wetland eventually. But, they don't nest right above the water or right next to it. So they're out up in the upland. And so they're really trying to be camouflaged for when they're sitting incubating their eggs. So they really want to remain hidden and look very grass-like. And this plumage really, really helps them to do that. Conveniently for us, it also helps to demarcate the dabblers and the divers. So if you see, a brown duck, take a look at how the body feathers are patterned. Are they really intricate? That's going to lead you to looking at your dabbling ducks. Or like the bottom birds, if they're a lot more plain, each of those feathers doesn't have all of that little kind of edging and center color. The feathers are far more plain, especially when you're looking at the body feathers on the diving ducks. And that's because some of these species will nest directly over water, so they'll build a nest, in some wetland vegetation over the water, or they'll build very close to the water, or some of them build their nests in cavities, and they don't really, they just need to look quite dark as well. So there's really kind of a functional difference. So when you're looking at your hens, just quickly take a look at how intricately, patterned those body feathers are, and that'll help separate them into the dabblers and the divers for you without, seeing the birds forage. So that can be quite convenient. Okay, now we're going to cover our dabbling hens. So we've got three that have orange bills. We've got the mallard, gadwall, and northern shoveler. The mallard's bill is going to be quite brightly orange, and there's going to be a dark saddle or dark speckles in the center of the bill. So you can see this image here. She's really got this kind of dark, exaggerated black splotch, kind of that, saddle. It rests over the bill, that dark coloration. Moving on to the gadwall bill, it's going to be just edged in orange. The center of it is going to be dark, but still having that kind of orange edge to the side. So it's not uniformly colored. It's not entirely dark and it's not entirely orange. The northern shoveler, she's also going to have this orange bill. It's a bit more olivey. It's not quite a bright orange at all. Maybe a little bit on just the margin of it, but the center is really going to be this interesting mix of orange and olive colored. Of course, it's going to be rather large. She's going to have that kind of spatulate bill, right? So the northern shovelers, they all have that kind of shoehorn shaped bill. So it is pretty distinct once you get used to looking at ducks and duck bills. As soon as you see the northern shoveler hen, it's going to be obvious. It's just this massive bill on this duck is quite hilarious to see. So those are the bills. Sometimes, especially I find on the hens, because they're otherwise so brown, even if there's just a little bit of color poking out from their speculum patch, it can, be helpful and lead you to the correct identification. And I find this is, most often true with the mallards, where some of that kind of blue with the black and white border is going to be just peeking out of the wings while she's at rest. So you can take a look at that on the mallard, that kind of blue bordered with black and white. The speculum patch on the gadwall hen is white, and you can just see a little bit of white poking out here. It's not a very big white patch when the bird is, extending her wings, but you can sometimes make out that kind of just little bit of a white patch. I've seen it less often on the northern shoveler hens. For whatever reason, it seems like they hold their wings a little bit more, tightly. But otherwise, she's also got a green speculum with a white border above. She doesn't have that kind of intense powdery blue patch that the drake has. If you look at the patterning on the face, both the mallard and the gadwall have a bit of that eye line. And especially the mallard, her face tends to be, you know, less bold, kind of less more cool tones than the rest of her body. So I find there's a little bit of a contrast there between the head and the body. Less so on the gadwall, she just has that nice little eye line, and the northern shoveler hen really has more of a plain face to her. Zoom in even closer here with our two dabbling hens with those orange bills. Really, the patterning on the bill is going to be quite helpful for your ID. So again, the mallard hen is going to have this orange bill with these, either this dark blotch in the center of it, or it's going to be having these kind of little speckled patches on it. Some hens really don't have as big of a blotch as others do. And the gadwall, again, it's going to be kind of that two-tone color. So dark in the center and orange along the sides of it. And of course, if they're showing that little speculum patch, that orange really stands out like a sore thumb on an otherwise very brown bird. Okay, I've got some other dabbling hens, more in the kind of medium size. American widgeon, a little bit smaller. Northern pintail, actually, a decent sized bird. And what I find stands out on the northern pintail hen the most to me is that she's got a very plain face, and it's much warmer, richer brown than the rest of her body. And I know that sounds really subtle, but it does, help you in the field when you do see the hen, she really does have a very, very plain face, and it is warmer, richer brown than the rest of the body. She's got an all dark bill, and if you do get to see her in flight, she's got a bronzy speculum with a white border above and below. The American widgeon hen, she's got this kind of dark little eye shadowing, so kind of reminiscent of the male's, great big eyeshadow. She's just got a bit of, darkness around, kind of that dark smudge around the eye. Otherwise has a very small little bill. The bill's going to be the same as the drake's. So edged in dark with this kind of plain kind of powdery bluish gray color. It's quite little. It's quite a nice little bill on her. She does have a little bit of that kind of warm brown tone on the side, and take a look at that. If you see a pair of them together, the drake's going to have that pinkish side, and she's going to have a little bit more brown, but still, noticeably warm flanks on this little lady. So those are our two kind of other dabbling hens. Next, we've got the little ones. So these two are, notoriously, especially for beginners, really tough to tell apart. Blue-winged teal and green-winged teal. They're both quite small ducks. They both have dark bills. And if you do see their wings, they both have a green speculum. So it's not, the most helpful. What you want to do when you see these tiny little dabbling hens with, dark bills is take a look first. Oops. Take a look first at the rear end. If you can see this cream patch along the back end here of the green-winged teal, that's a dead giveaway. It took me years to figure that out. And, if you're seeing this little duck otherwise very, very, intricately brown patterned, having this kind of nice little, it's either like kind of bit of a white color or a cream color on the hen. So that's really helpful to take a look at. If you can't see that part of the bird, the next thing you're gonna want to do is take a look at the face. So green-winged teal is overall gonna have a much darker, more, compact look, but definitely a darker face. So she's gonna have a darker eye line, darker cap. If you're looking at the blue-winged teal, she's got these kind of pale little eye arcs above and below the eye and a pale base to the bill. So the blue-winged teal hen overall looks like she's got a much paler face. Take a look for those little eye arcs. Take a look at the base of the bill. Green-winged teal lacks that. There's no eye arcs, there's no pale base, so it overall just looks like, quite a dark little face. So those are the two things. So take a look at the rear end, see if you can find a little cream patch, and then take a look at the face. And I'm hopeful that with those tips, you'll be able to start separating out, your small little dabbling hens. But it all takes practice. So if you can just say like, I don't know, but I know it's a teal, I mean, you're already doing a great job. So, don't stress out too much if it seems really fine and really particular. It's because it is. It's not the easiest thing to distinguish. So, you know, just try to remember some of those key points and look for that white patch at the rear end. So, hopefully that helps you a little bit with your tiny dabbling hens. Okay, I'm gonna take a quick sip of water here. And we're gonna move on to the diving ducks. So these are two diving ducks that have red heads, and they look quite different in body color as well as head shape. So the canvasback is really going to have a bright white canvas-like back and body. It really, really stands out at a distance. It is a lot of white on a duck. So really, really bright white. And then this really distinctive head shape. There isn't another duck that has a head sloped quite like this on the canvas back. You can imagine if you're at the top and you're sitting in a toboggan, this seems like a manageable hill to sled down. If you're looking at a duck that has a red head and you're going, yikes, I probably wouldn't want a toboggan down this hill, you've got yourself a redhead. Of course, the body color is going to be different on the redhead. This is going to look quite a bit more dull and gray. So if you see the birds, at a distance, this gray is not going to, shine like the bright white does on the canvas back. So the canvas back, think bright white canvas. Of course, they do both have redheads, and that can be your first clue that you're looking at the redheads, and as well as it should. Um, the bill on the redhead is going to be this lovely kind of blue-gray with a nice little dark tip. On the canvas back, that bill is all black, but really that unique head shape, that kind of really gentle slope from the top of the head down to the tip of the bill. Really, really, really going to stand out at a distance for you. I'll show you another picture here with the two side by side, and it really does highlight the difference. That coloration, that white versus the gray, stands out a fair bit, as well as that nice gentle slope of the canvas back head and the quite steep slope on the red heads forehead onto the bill there. So just imagine yourself on a toboggan and, how terrified are you at the top of this toboggan hill might give you a good idea for canvasback versus redhead. Okay, now we covered a few black and white diving ducks, so let's get into them. Let's tear them apart. So we've got lesser scaup. Greater scaup is going to be seen on migration. It's going to be nesting much farther north than where many of us live in Canada, especially here on the prairies as well. They're going to be much farther north. So that one you're only likely to see on spring and fall migration. And then we also have the ringneck duck. So I like to think of these as kind of the Oreo cookie ducks. You have dark on the front and back and some sort of pale color, whitish gray in the middle. So think of these as your little Oreo cookie ducks. The first thing we want to do is take a look at the color of the back. Is it gray or is it black? Because in ringneck duck, that black is really, really going to stand out. It's really obvious at a distance. At a distance, this kind of variegated black and white coloration really is just going to turn gray. It really, you can't see all of those fine barrings. It really just looks gray at any sort of distance. So does the back look gray or does the back look solid black? If it's solid black, you know for sure you've got yourself a ringneck duck. And also go ahead and check the bill. There's going to be this nice bright white ring around the end of the bill. That's going to, let you know for sure you've got yourself a ringneck duck. Now, trying to tell the scaup apart is not necessarily the easiest feat, and I struggle with this in the field regularly myself. So if you're in migration season and you're only comfortable calling them scaup, that, you're doing great. But if you want to try to tease them apart, when the birds are at rest, so they're not actively feeding, they're not wandering around, they're just kind of hanging out on the water. The lesser scaup, the head is going to appear to peak farther back on the head than it is on the greater scaup. So the greater scaup's going to have a peak that's a little bit farther forward on the head. It winds up making almost a funny looking shape of the bird's head. So that peak is a little bit farther forward on the bird's head in the greater scop and farther back in the lesser scop. Both of these birds have some iridescence to them, and that can kind of look variably bluish, um, bluish purple or a little bit greenish, but that can be, tough. They can both kind of show some of those similar colorations. So while the birds are at rest, take a look at where the peak is on the head. In flight, greater and lesser scop, this is going to be probably the easiest way to tell them apart, but you probably won't get tons of opportunity to see them fly, unfortunately. Greater scop, there's going to be more white extending from the secondaries towards the wingtip than there is going to be on the lesser scop. The lesser scop, that white is going to be restricted to just the secondary feathers. So like the speculum patch that we were discussing fairly regularly with the dabbling ducks, that same patch is just going to show white in the lesser scop. The rest of the feathers are going to be, dark kind of grayish looking, but in the greater scop, that white is going to extend a bit into the primary feathers. It's going to be heading out towards the tip of the wing there. So that can be a good way to tell them apart if you are seeing them in flight. And if you happen to be a photographer with a great big lens, then you can, snap lots of photos of them in flight, and it can be easier to tell, from a still photo rather than birds in flight. But that's a little bit of telling the greater and lesser scop, one from the other. During the breeding season in, parts of southern Canada where most of us live, so, the prairies, southern Quebec, southern Ontario, you're going to be seeing lesser scop during the breeding season. So you can also just call them scop during migration, and again, you'll be ahead of the game. It is a tough one to tell apart. Okay, we also have a couple of small diving ducks, and they're pretty unique looking little birds. Ruddy duck especially, they're, just this gorgeous cinnamon rusty color to it, this great big white cheek patch, this ridiculously blue, sky bright blue little bill. And they're in a group of birds known as the stiff-tailed ducks because they do have stiff little tail feathers, and especially the drakes, they love to, float around with that tail stuck up in the air. So ruddy ducks are really cute little guys, that bright white cheek patch, and really the shape of the duck is going to be, a giveaway. They're really compact little birds. An even smaller little guy is the bufflehead, and this great big white patch on the back of the head for the drakes is really going to be your dead giveaway. This huge, huge white patch taking over a large portion of the back of the bird's head. Otherwise, black above and kind of white below. It's really an interesting mix of colors there, unlike some of the other ones we've seen where, the Oreo cookie where it was front and back. This is really top and bottom. So top going to be dark on the body and white below, has a stubby little bill as well. Going back to the hens, just remember those dabbling hens are really going to have those intricately patterned feathers, and the hens of the diving species really are going to have quite plain feathers on their body. So what becomes the most easy way to tell, the canvasback from everything else is really going to be focusing in on that head shape for the hen. There's going to be a large diving duck and really has that kind of exaggerated, gentle slope from the top of the head down to the tip of the bill. Otherwise, pretty warm coloration, kind of warmish tones, a little bit of a pale eye ring there, and a little bit of a pale throat, but really that head shape is really going to be your dead giveaway for your canvas back. Because otherwise, some of the brown diving hens look fairly similar. So we've got the ringneck duck, redhead, and lesser scop. The greater scop is going to look rather similar to the lesser scop, and I've only gone into detail for the lesser scop hen here. So the ringneck duck, really, if you're seeing kind of these medium to large brown diving hens, take a look at the bill first and take a look to see if there is a ring around the tip of the bill. The ringneck duck is going to show that ring around the end of the bill. So that takes care of the ringneck duck. Now, that's going to leave you the redhead and the lesser scop, and they can look, halfway similar, but the lesser scop hen is going to have this kind of yellowish brown eye, which I always feel kind of gives the bird a bit of a crazed look to it. I don't know why. That's just how it looks to me. So Both of them are going to have dark bills, but the redhead is going to have a dark eye, a little bit of a pale eye ring, a little bit of a pale eyeshadow, a little bit of pale base of the bill. The lesser scaup is going to have that kind of brownish eye, a little bit of a steep forehead, but the redhead is also going to have that as well. And there's going to be a variable amount of white at the base of the bill. Some hens, before they're in breeding plumage are really going to have, quite a fair bit of bright white, but as they molt into their eclipse plumage, they're really going to be quite dull. So a little bit of white around the base of the bill, and some of them show a fair bit more. This is one where looking at the eye color is really going to help you out here. So eye color, yellow-brown in the lesser scaup, and dark in the redhead. And of course, our small little diving hens. The ruddy duck hen is going to have that stiff tail. I find that the hens don't go around with their tail stuck straight up in the air quite as much as the drakes do, but she's going to have this kind of little whitish patch below the eye and going to have a dark streak, almost like, a football player would put on a dark streak below the eye. I like to think of the ruddy duck hen putting on that little dark streak below the eye. That kind of just reminds me of it. And, it's quite a compact little bird, so maybe it's even football shaped if you can imagine that. The bufflehead, on the other hand, is going to be quite dark. So, none of this warm brownish tones of the ruddy duck hen, very dark overall, and this white patch, kind of this oval on its side, kind of behind and below the level of the eye. A little bit of a white patch on the wing is often visible, and just a really small little stubby bill. The ruddy duck actually has, a relatively large bill for the duck's size. The bufflehead has a teeny tiny little bill for the size. So those are your small diving hens. Phew, we made it through the ducks. It's only 43 minutes in. This is going to be a little bit of a long one. Okay, so we've got a couple of grebe species. We've got redneck grebe and pie-billed grebe. Grebes are also divers. They're not, they're not ducks. They're in their own grouping. Their legs are really far back on their body, and they have these, pointy little bills, some of them quite large. So redneck grebe, really going to be focusing on that silvery cheek patch. It's a relatively large grebe, has a long kind of yellowish bill with a dark tip to it, but that silvery cheek patch really, really stands out at a distance. It's remarkable how brightly that cheek shines and how much that kind of red neck and dark body just kind of merge into, some amorphous dark color. So this is one that's really helpful to learn the call because they're quite vocal and it carries really well over water, and they make kind of a whinny braying noise. Okay, pie-billed grebe, on the other hand, is overall small, compact, and fairly brownish. The thing that really stands out is going to be that bicolored bill. So it's going to have this relatively short, but kind of pale grayish bill with a pale eye ring that's really quite distinct, and this black ring around the bill. All of these grebes have really reduced tail feathers, so there's really not going to be much tail to speak of. But the pie-billed grebe, overall kind of chunky, blocky, very dark in color. They don't like to be seen a whole lot, so you'll be lucky to get some looks at the pie-billed grebe. They often like to go underwater and hide away from sight, so it's really useful to learn their calls. And there's two calls that they do regularly, one called the ow hoop call and another called the hyena, because it sounds a bit like laughter. So here's the ow hoop call. And they can vary the length of the call, but it follows that general pattern. And here is the hyena call. So really kind of sounds like a bit of a laughter in the marsh, and pairs will get together and duet this hyena so you can get two of them doing it at the same time. Two other similar grebes to one another, you got the horned grebe and the eared grebe. Head shape is going to be really helpful in this case. The eared grebe really has a very nice pointy triangular look to the head, especially at a distance. The horned grebe is going to have a bit more of a flatter profile head. If it does have the peak, it's going to be farther back on the head. And both look quite similar, especially if, the eared grebe's wispy plume behind the eye, like sometimes those can get wet and kind of stuck a little bit together, but they're very different in where they hang out and who they hang out with. So the horned grebes really prefer small little water bodies, and they're going to be found in pairs, whereas the eared grebes, they like, shallow water bodies, but they're going to be found in groups. They're a colonial nester. So you won't usually see just one or two eared grebes. You're usually going to see, five, six, a dozen, 20, 30. I've had, upwards of 50 or 60 in a location trying to do a bird survey. So the eared grebes are really going to be found more often in groups, and the horned grebes usually just in pairs and often in really small little ponds. Those are our horned and eared grebes. Two other similar looking grebes to each other is the Western and Clark's grebe. They're both going to be quite elegant, long-necked, long-billed, black and white birds with that kind of black cap, whitish neck and belly, and great big dark back. The Western grebe, the black is going to be encompassing the eye, and the Clark's grebe, you can see the eye more clearly because the white surrounds the eye. Bill color is also different. The Clark's grebe is going to have a much more vibrant, richer yellow bill, whereas the Western grebe is going to have a much more muted yellowish tone to the bill. Now, Western grebe is going to be by far the most numerous, grebe that you'll see. Clark's grebe, you'll be, oftentimes lucky to see any. I've only ever seen, I think, maybe two myself. So Western grebe is definitely the predominant grebe. They overlap almost entirely in range, but Clark's grebe are sometimes sneaking in there. So whenever you see these grebes, keep an eye out to look out for your Clark's grebe there. Okay, rails definitely tend to be a bit more secretive for the most part, with the exception of the American coot. The American coot is a rail that really acts a lot like a duck. You'll find it out, just sitting on the water, bobbing around, much like a duck does. So it's going to be solid black, except there's going to be this great big, kind of white bill with this little red shield, and they're going to have little white tail feathers that they can display as a kind of, waving a little white flag against some territorial dispute. So very jet black overall with this white bill, and very much acts like a duck, but as you can see, the bill is not shaped like a duck's bill at all. That's the American coot. Sora is among the more, secretive of the rails. I guess out of all of the rails that are secretive, it is probably a little bit less sneaky. You have a much greater chance of seeing a Sora than you would some other rail species. So the Sora is going to have this nice little black mask, this bright yellow bill to it, and otherwise kind of, heavily patterned flanks and back. So you can get a glimpse of these, but they're far more often heard than seen. And they're very, very vocal. They'll get going. Even if you slam your car door next to a wetland, they'll be doing their calls. So they make two calls that are really distinctive, that are worth learning. So you've got the whinny call. And the per week call. So if you're patient, you might just see them, wander out of the reeds, go looking for food. But it's really good to learn their calls because definitely more often heard than seen. The American coots make kind of all these popping and burry and popping noises within the wetland. Still useful to know their calls, but you're predominantly going to, ID them through visual means. and that was the American coot. Two very secretive rails. We've got the Virginia rail and yellow rail. The Virginia rail has a drooping red bill and this kind of grayish plain face on an otherwise kind of warm brownish body. They're more active kind of at dawn and dusk and at night, and they're far more often heard than seen. And they just really don't like to come out and be seen very much at all. So consider yourself very lucky if you do see one. So they have two regular calls that they do. One of them is the ticket, and they'll keep doing this kind of for a stretch of time. They'll go ticket, 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 ticket. And they also do a grunting call, which to me sounds a little bit like a pig in the wetland. And this is one that they will occasionally do as a duet, so you might have two birds doing this together. And of course, the much more hard to encounter yellow rail. This is definitely a bird that is very rarely seen. It much prefers to wander through the reeds than to ever get up and fly, and it is often, only found in sedgy or grassy wetlands, and is essentially a nocturnal species. They don't call very much during the day, though if you get far north onto the James Bay and Hudson Bay coasts, they do call a bit more during the day there because in some places there's very little nighttime, but in the south they're extremely nocturnal, and they make this rhythmic tick 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 call that sounds like two stones tapping together. Okay, we also covered a couple of bitterns. We've got the American bittern and the least bittern. Both of these bitterns are quite difficult to see, even though the American bittern is quite a large bird. It really, does its best to try to, blend in with all of the grasses and reeds. So these are definitely ones that it is much more worthwhile to learn the calls of. So the American bittern call, this pump or lunk, really can travel, a kilometer in distance almost. It is quite loud and it travels a great distance. So here's the American bittern's pump or lunk call. And the least bittern, much more of an eastern species, does get into Manitoba a little bit and extremely scarcely into Saskatchewan. Does this little cuckoo cuckoo coo calling from the wetland. Very fond of dense cattail marshes. So those are the two bittern species. We also have a regular heron and an ibis that we covered. So the great blue heron, this is definitely going to be a bird that you're going to identify visually as opposed to by sound. They do make some grunting noises, but for the most part, they're rather silent birds. They're quite large birds, and they're often, seen standing quite stoically on the edge of any sort of water body, whether it be a lake or, a smaller wetland. They're going to be this ambush predator, so they're going to be hanging out and just spearing anything that comes their way. So kind of this blue-gray overall. If you see them at the high point of the breeding season, they've got these long black plumes, and they do have plumes that go down from the back of the head. Great big, mostly yellowish bill, a little bit of dark on it, but quite a beautiful large bird. On the other hand, the white-faced ibis is a more recent visitor. You'll see them more regularly than in Alberta than you will in Saskatchewan, but they're increasing here in Saskatchewan, and I'm sure Manitoba will start to be seeing some in the near future if you aren't already. White-faced ibis is a rather dark, kind of shorebird looking creature with a very long gray drooping bill, but otherwise kind of this, maroon brown coloration with some iridescence going on the wings and these lovely red legs. So that is the white-faced ibis. Moving on to some shorebirds. The first one is the Wilson snipe, and it is much more easily heard than seen because they love to do these winnowing flight displays where they fly up and they bomb downwards, and the sound is made by the wind going over their tail feathers. So they do this lovely winnowing flight display. And if you're out in an area that's kind of has wet ground and lots of wetland habitat around you, you're likely to be hearing this winnowing all around you. It's quite magical. They also do a squeaky wheel type call where they'll just go keck, 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 keck. It really does sound like a squeaking little wheel. Killdeer is one that you are just as likely to see as you are to hear. This is a small little plover, and it shows these nice two dark rings around the neck, and it also has two kind of dark bands across the face, one across the bill, and one kind of connecting the two eyes there. Plain brown above, and kind of has a pigeon-like head. The plovers are really having that kind of small pigeon-like head. So it is a very vocal bird. If you get anywhere, near it, it will often just get up and start calling, and it does variations of killdeer. Killdeer are also famous for their broken wing display, so they will display, this white patch above their rump, and they will kind of droop their wings and act like an injured bird. And, they're doing that to lure, predators, which includes people, away from their nest and or young. Got a couple more shorebirds here. These are more easily seen than heard for sure. Got the Wilson's phalarope, American avocet, and black-necked stilt. Wilson's phalarope has this very fine needle-like bill. There's this nice dark eye line that extends from behind the eye, kind of a salmony wash on the throat, and on the females, this kind of bold colored, blue and rusty colored on the back. You'll often see them out in some open water doing, circles very, very quickly, and they're stirring up, little bits of insects and crustaceans with their feet, upwelling them to the water surface and then picking them off. They also have this very butterfly-like, flight. They're very buoyant and very kind of erratic. That's your Wilson's phalarope. American avocet is a very classy looking bird, has this lovely salmon wash to the head and these bold black and white wings. It's a very long, fine, slightly upturned bill with a bit more upturn in the females than the males. Black-necked stilt is a black and white bird on impossibly long, skinny, bubblegum pink legs. It's a very distinct little shorebird. It also has a very, fine needle-like bill. This overall black and white plumage coloration is really, it really stands out, especially on those impossibly long, dainty little legs. American avocet also has long, dainty legs, but just they seem impossibly frail on the black-necked stilt. Two other large shorebirds that you're going to likely encounter are the willet and the marbled godwit. So the willet overall is more cool gray tones. The marbled godwit has much more brownish, warm tones. The bills, take a look at those. On the willet, it's going to be straight and basically gray entirely. The marbled godwit going to have a longer bill, slightly upturned, and it's bicolored. So it's going to be kind of orangey red at the base, fading into a dark little tip. In flight, the willet shows really bold, distinct black and white wing patterns. The marbled godwit is really just going to increase in those kind of reddish, warm tones, really, really dark kind of cinnamon tones on the wings if you see them in flight. Both of these birds are extremely vocal, so if you're seeing them, you are likely also hearing them, and they will spot you from, half a mile away and let you know that they've seen you by calling very loudly and announcing your presence. The willet is another namesayer. It says willet, willet, or it also says pill will willet, variations on those two themes. So let's listen to that now. And the godwit also says its name, says variations of godwit. So it might say God, wit, or keep going as a godwit. Not the most relaxing sound in the world in terms of bird calls. So those are the quite vociferous willet and marbled godwit. I'm going to give you a bonus. Yellowlegs, I see we're running short on time, so I won't cover them extensively. Just to let you know that especially on, migration, you're often going to see yellowlegs. They are some of the later migrants, and the failed nesters, or the ones that haven't nested at all, come back sooner than most other shorebirds. So, by the end of June, sometimes you'll have yellowlegs coming back, and they will only have kind of left, in early June, some of them. So you're likely to see these birds. They nest in the boreal forest, but they, you know, late migrants, and some of them, return quite a fair bit more early. They're kind of these grayish shorebirds, and they have these bright, long yellow legs. The lesser yellowlegs has a relatively shorter bill than the greater. So you can imagine the head length being relatively equal to the bill length for the lesser, and the head length being shorter than the length of the bill in the greater yellowlegs. So you can see that is about the head length copied over here, and the bill extends past that head length on the bill end of it. But just to know, if you can't tell them apart and you call them yellow legs, this is still a good, tip, because even if you can only do that, they're often tough to identify. You know, one is larger than the other, but that's really only helpful with they're next to other birds that you know the size of, or especially if they're next to each other. So both of them are this grayish color above, white below, and have these very long yellow legs. And they are so challenging, in fact, that there is this joke bird book that I once got called A Field Guide to the Little Known and Seldom Seen Birds of North America, joking about the yellow legs because there is a bit of size variation in them. So we got greatest yellow legs, greater yellow legs, middle yellow legs, slightly lesser yellow legs, and so on and so forth. So if you find them confusing, that's because they are, and it's a well-known fact. And I don't think anybody will hold it against you if you say yellow legs. I wasn't sure on the species. Okay, we've got a couple of terns coming up. We've got the black tern and the common and forester's tern. The black tern is really quite a fair bit different than the common and forester's. The black tern, as its name suggests, has this black body and head on these very silvery pale wings and tail. It's very buoyant in flight, and it picks insects off the water. Common and forester's terns look very, very similar to one another. They have this nice dark cap, whitish body, and grayish upper parts. Telling the two apart, really helpful if the birds are perched. The common tern is going to have these nice dark folded wing feathers, and the wing feathers are going to look silvery folded up on the forester's tern. The tail length is also helpful here. The common tern has a short tail length compared to the tips of the wings when they are folded at rest, whereas the forester's tern, that really long forked tail, hangs, a fair bit out over, the relatively shorter wings on the forester's tern. The bill color is slightly different, but I find that is such a difficult color to ascertain that it's not one that I tell people to focus on, because it all depends on the lighting and how well you see the bird. It can be tough to tell those two colors apart. In flight, the common tern has this continuous gray color from the back all the way out to the wings. Both birds can show a little bit of a dark wedge in the wing, but take a look at the overall color and compare, the gray on further out on the wing to the back. If it's continuous, you've got a common, and for the foresters, that dark color on the back fades into this kind of silvery whitish color on the back. So common continuous, foresters fades. So if you can remember that, that will help you try to tell these two birds apart. Now again, they don't always give you great looks at them. There are plenty of times where I have not been able to identify one of these terns to a species because it simply, I didn't get a good enough look. The looks that it gave me were unhelpful. So, it is perfectly natural to not be able to tell every individual to species. It happens. That's just how birding goes. Okay, we've got two small little wrens coming up. Both of these birds are much better to focus on the hearing because they are small, they are brown, and they don't make themselves terribly visible for terribly long. They're both going to look very similar if you're just seeing this small bird at a distance. So the marsh wren has this kind of liquidy sounding, gurgling rattle, and an individual will vary its little phrases between songs. So have a listen for the gurgling rattle of the marsh wren. So kind of this gurgling chit chat in the marsh versus the sedge wren is really going to have a kind of harsh staccato sewing machine like rattle. So you're going to have a couple of intro notes followed by this rattle. So have a listen for the much drier, much more mechanical sounding sedge wren. So much more consistent between songs than the marsh wren's kind of rambling, gurgly rattle. And play it again, the more sewing machine, harsh rattle with a couple of intro notes followed by a rattle. Okay, we've got two more small little birds that are also best told apart by sound, the LeConte sparrow and the Nelson's sparrow. LeConte sparrow, wet meadows. Nelson sparrow likes it a little bit more wet meadows and sedgy marshes. The LeConte sparrow sounds much more like an insect. It's kind of harsher. It goes ticka tsh. And the Nelson sparrow has a much more sizzly, ephemeral, kind of bacon sizzle call. It really doesn't travel any sort of distance, so you're going to be relatively close to it when you hear it. So here, listen to the LeConte sparrow kind of bacon sizzle call. I also try to remember it as going tequila. So really sizzly, really quite ephemeral. I'll just play the LeContes once more. Much more insect-like, harsher. More bacon sizzle for the Nelson sparrow. Okay, moving right along to the blackbirds. We've got three blackbird species, two of them very helpfully named. We've got the red-winged blackbird and the yellow-headed blackbird. The name really describes how the bird looks, and the bobolink, a little bit different in that regard, but kind of this black and white blackbird with this great big patch on the back of the head, really reminiscent of the bufflehead. That bobolink also has this kind of straw-colored patch on the back of its head. So all of these are worth learning the calls of. Red-winged blackbird, it can be quite variable. They'll often do variations on this conqueree call. And the yellow-headed blackbird is much more snarly, not very musical sounding, although one of their songs is described as their musical one. And these are two species where it's really easy to start associating the bird with the sound because they're very visible, they're very easy to identify, and they all call very frequently. So this is a good one to practice your ear tuning while looking at the bird. And the bobolink makes these incredible R2D2 robotic sounding noises. I always think it's amazing that there's a bird that sounds like that. The female blackbirds are, for the most part, a fair bit different, especially the red-winged blackbird and the bobolink. The yellow-headed blackbird, that female is kind of reminiscent of the male. She's brown overall and has a reduced amount of yellow on kind of the face and neck. She's also got a nice little black mask that stands out a fair bit more on her. So overall, kind of plain brown body and this yellowish patch on the face and breast. Red-winged blackbird, she's going to look very kind of brown and streaky. Blackbirds all have this kind of long, kind of pointed bill, this cone-shaped bill, so you can really see that on the red-winged blackbird. She's got this nice white eyebrow, dark bill, and is overall streaky brown. She's going to be hanging out with the males. The female bobolink is, much harder to see overall. She doesn't make herself quite as visible. They don't live necessarily, in as big of a colony as, say, the red-winged blackbirds do, or just in association with a ton of others. So I find there's less chances to see the female. She's straw-colored overall. She still has that kind of pointed cone-shaped bill of the blackbirds, but overall kind of straw-colored and streaky, has a little bit of a dark eyeline behind the eye, and this kind of pinkish bill. All of them do have that long kind of blackbird style bill. The one raptor that we've covered, we've got the northern harrier. This is a bird that is going to be cruising low in flight over wetlands, and conveniently, both sexes, while they look different, is going to show this nice little white rump patch, between the bird's back and the tail on the upper side of the bird. And the behavior, that kind of cruising low over those wetlands and that kind of long tail and white patch, is really the thing to key in on for this species. They will give you a pretty good look at their back just in the way that they cruise low over, fields and wetlands, and often, tilt from side to side. So you're often going to be seeing the back of this bird. The males are kind of this blue-grayish color with dark wingtips and a dark trailing edge, especially visible from below. And the females and the young birds are all going to be kind of brown and streaky overall, so quite dark brown above and a bit of kind of warm, rusty tones below, but a heavy amount of streaking. So take a look out for that white rump patch and that behavior, that cruising low over wetlands and fields. We also covered a warbler. In a lot of these wetland locations, you're going to have common yellowthroats singing. So the males have this cute little black bandit mask with this kind of whitish coloration above it and a bright yellow throat. The females are really plain overall. They're kind of olive colored with this bright yellowish throat and this small little eye ring. The throat can be maybe less yellow in some of the females, but it will always contrast with the rest of the face. So it's going to look a fair bit paler than the rest of the bird's face. The males often sing versions of witchety witchety witch or witchety witchety witchety, something along those lines, often repeated kind of 3.5 to 4 times. So that is the witchety 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 call of, or the song of the common yellowthroat. And this is one, they sing a fair bit, so it's really useful to tune into that. And then you can maybe try to look out for this little, bird with the black bandit mask. All warblers are really active and they don't often sit in one place for very long, so it can be really tough to get a good look at, either the male or the female. You'll likely have more success trying to find the male because he is going to be announcing himself with that song, and he does have that kind of really distinct black bandit mask across his face. Phew, we got through the birds. Holy smokes. Okay, we will quickly go and cover the frogs. we covered quite a few amphibians. So we got the boreal chorus frog and the wood frog. The boreal chorus frog is a small little frog, and more often than not, this is a song. This is a frog that you're going to be hearing more than you're going to be seeing. But if you do happen to see it, it's got a dark line that extends from the snout through the eye and down the side of the body. Sometimes that line is a little bit broken up, but it still has a kind of a distinct, darker, series of splotches along the side of it. Oftentimes I find them with that little dark line going through. The wood frog, on the other hand, is just going to have this kind of dark patch mostly behind the eye. It's kind of like this great big wedge right behind the eye, and it doesn't continue down, as a dark line or splotches along the side. That really dark color is restricted to that small patch behind the eye. Sound wise, the boreal chorus frog sounds like you're running your fingernail or your thumbnail over the teeth of a comb. Let's listen to that. The wood frog kind of sounds like harsh quacks coming from the wetland. Sounds pretty funny when you get a bunch of them going at the same time. Northern leopard frogs are actually considered a species at risk. They have these large spots on their bodies that are kind of haloed with a bit of a, paler color around them. And they make a call, and it kind of sounds a bit like rubbing balloons together. Spring peepers kind of barely make their way onto the prairies. There's been the odd, sighting of them in Saskatchewan, but mostly you're going to be finding them in Manitoba and eastward. These guys are really, really tiny, and they have a nice little X on their back. It's very convenient. Little X marks the spot on their back, and they make an extremely loud call for their body size, and it sounds very, very loud, and it kind of just peeps, and especially you often have several of them going together, and it can sound almost deafening. Okay, there's also two species of tree frogs, and you'll pretty much only get these in Manitoba and further eastward. We've got the gray tree frog and Cope's gray tree frog. They are both identical in terms of visual. They look the same. They're actually very closely related. The gray tree frog has a regular set of chromosomes. The Cope's gray tree frog has twice as many. But they are separate species. They don't seem to interbreed. And they have differences in calls. So if you listen to the gray tree frog, you can sort of hear the pulses in the call. That kind of sounds like a whir. Compare that to the Cope's gray tree frog, and it sounds more buzzy, more like a burr. A little bit quiet. Anyway, there is a difference in call. I'm sorry. I should have made sure that those were the enhanced loud versions. So you can hear the pulses in the gray tree frog more like a whir versus the more buzzy burr of the Cope's gray tree frog, and relatively flat pitched. It doesn't rise in pitch at all. Got a few toads as well, the Canadian toad and the American toad. The American toad just kind of, ekes its way into Manitoba in the east there. If you're in Saskatchewan and Alberta, Canadian toad is the one you're going to be more likely to encounter. If you do, happen to see these toads and want to identify them in the hand, you're going to be looking at the cranial crests, so that those kind of lumps between the eyes. In the Canadian toad, those two lumps between the eyes actually meet and they touch. In the American toad, those lumps kind of surrounding the eye, really, they don't touch at all, and they kind of make an L shape that kind of encompasses the eye. You can see that here on this little American toad. They have differences in calls, but they're very similar, and both of them are kind of long, monotone trills. So I'll play the Canadian toad first, and then the American toad. So there's actually two individuals there, and oftentimes when you get a lot of amphibians calling together at the same time, they'll just vary their pitches just a little bit so they don't completely overlap with their neighbor, and they're still trying to stand out and get noticed among the crowd. The American toad has a much longer monotone trill, up to 30 seconds in duration. But overall, very similar sounding between the both species. Far more infrequently encountered are the plains spadefoot and Great Plains toad. Both of them are fossorial, meaning that they spend most of their time living underground. The plains spadefoot has more of a whirring call. It kind of sounds like motorboating. Oh no, that's the one. So short whirs. Whereas the Great Plains toad sounds a little different. This is the one that kind of sounds like motorboating, where you're going. I've only ever heard the Great Plains toad, and I would love to see either of these little guys. Maybe we'll do that this year with a wet spring. Maybe they'll be out. I would be very excited. And last but not least, we also covered a couple of tiger salamanders. We have the western and the eastern. Eastern just kind of ekes into eastern Manitoba, whereas the western tiger salamander, you'll find that across the prairies. There's several different subspecies of the western salamander, so they can look quite a bit different depending on the subspecies. Some of them are quite dark in coloration, and some of them are quite bold in coloration. The subspecies that is most likely to overlap with the eastern tiger salamander has kind of an opposite pattern to the body of the eastern tiger salamander. So the eastern tiger salamander can be described as a dark salamander with yellow spots on it, and the western form that is most likely to overlap looks more like it's got a yellow olive colored base with dark spots. So a little bit opposite of the eastern tiger salamanders, but very neat little guys. They reproduce in little fishless ponds, and they spend parts of their lives underwater in their larval form. You can see the gills sticking out of this little larval form here. Here's a juvenile and an adult one for the eastern. So very neat little creatures. They'll become terrestrial. Most adults as they age. Apparently some of the adults just never leave the water. I don't know enough about tiger salamanders or salamanders in general, but they're kind of fascinating little critters. And they do burrow, so they need sandy, kind of easily scoopable, diggable soil for the adults to be able to get underground and maintain their body moisture. But really interesting little critters. So hopefully you get to see some tiger salamanders sometime in your life. They're neat. Phew. Oh my goodness. So, if anybody wants to go out and collect a MarshWatch checklist, you can do so using the Nature Counts app. Register for MarshWatch on the Nature Counts website. You can download the Nature Counts app on the smartphone or print off a data sheet that's available on the MarshWatch website. On the back of that data sheet, I do have some cheat sheet information for some cryptic bird calls and descriptions of, the male ducks, if that is going to be helpful to you. So feel free to download that and, share it with whoever. And if you want, you can just go observe any wetland that you like and identify and count the birds and note the amphibians. And, if you're not feeling very confident about most of the species, you can say this is an incomplete checklist. Or if you're feeling confident that you're reporting all of the wetland birds that you're able to, you can go ahead and mark that as a complete checklist. And yeah, submit it through the app for easy breezy data entry, or if you're old school and take it with pen and paper on the data sheet or just in a notebook, you can submit it on the Nature Counts website. Next week, as I mentioned, we'll do a brief recap of wetland importance, and then we'll immerse ourselves in some soundscapes, and we'll put some of this knowledge, a little bit to use. And I think what I'm going to have you do is try to pick out certain species and certain recordings so you can practice listening through all of the calls. We'll also go over a little bit of the plant review, because we did cover some plant species, but I didn't want to cram it into this webinar because holy smokes, it's a lot. And then I'll just talk about, the MarshWatch stats, how many hours of videos were watched, how many people attended, overall. So tune in if you want to for that, and then we'll also have some question and discussion period. Again, if you want more details for the upcoming walks, you can visit the MarshWatch page. I have some of them already ready to go, and I'll be adding details soon for the remaining walks. I don't think I have anything up for Prince Albert, Winnipeg, and Blaine Lake yet, but I will be adding those in the coming week. So stay tuned for more details. I think next week I'll go into some of the more details of the walks as we do the wrap up webinar, but details to come. If you want to join, I would really love to see it. I think it will be a fun time. And thank you all a ton for tuning in. I know this was a bit of a long one and going to be a little bit late for some folks. So if you ever want to reach out, I'm skatlas@birdscanada.org. You can visit the MarshWatch website. Probably easier just to Google MarshWatch and Birds Canada. You can reach out to Birds Canada or follow us on any of the social media. If you're able to, and enjoyed the series, you're welcome to go online and give a donation. We are a national not-for-profit. And I would just like to thank the people, the corporations and agencies that made MarshWatch possible. That's the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, Sask Power, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. So thanks to them, and thanks to all of you.